Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's briefly take a step back and identify why we're here. The SEC and Gary Gensler have forced this committee's hand. There is simply no way that the digital assets ecosystem within the United States will survive without some kind of action from Congress to combat the regulatory deluge we've seen in the past few months. We've all heard from firms like Coinbase that they will move offshore. The reality is that in this environment, it's hard to blame them. In February, the SEC issued a proposed rulemaking that would severely restrict the ability of current custodians for registered investment advisors to continue to hold custody of those assets. Mr. Rivera, I'd like you to briefly speak to some of the challenges associated with the proposed rulemaking from the SEC for qualified custodians and how it would affect your firm. Specifically, as it stands, how many options does your firm have to custody digital assets, and would you expect this rulemaking to reduce your firm's options for providing custody services of digital assets?
Our firm has a very limited number of digital asset custodians. There are 3, perhaps 4. There are 3 that we trust. This rulemaking effectively reduces that to maybe 0. It seems like the intent is to make it extremely difficult to comply with the rule as proposed, which would mean that we could effectively be disenfranchised from being able to invest in the ecosystem.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to pivot to how broker-dealers work in the digital asset space and whether today's securities rules could possibly apply to the digital asset space as written. Broker-dealers that work with equities typically custody securities for their customers. However, with the current SEC custody rules, there's no way for a broker-dealer to directly custody customer assets. Mr. Zweighorn, can you describe what kinds of challenges this presents for broker-dealers within the digital asset space?
Sure, thank you for the question, Congressman. So as you said, broker-dealers typically will custody their investor securities on their behalf, and that is part of the services they provide that facilitates the customer trading. The SEC has rules that regulate how broker-dealers do in order to protect customers, called the Customer Protection Rule, to ensure that those brokers don't mishandle or lose or steal those assets. That rule was adopted in the 70s originally. It's been amended over time. And not surprisingly, it doesn't refer to holding a crypto private key as one of the ways that a broker-dealer can permissibly hold customer assets. The SEC has struggled with determining what would be a safe mechanism for broker-dealers to hold crypto assets for customers. And the most recent step they took was to put out guidance that was time-limited. It expires actually 3 years from today, that would allow broker-dealers to hold custody if they have reasonable policies and procedures, but then there's a list of other conditions that brokers essentially can't meet because it would mean they couldn't do any other business.
Thank you. Let's move on to clearing and settling. Within the securities market, you need some sort of entity that ensures that a trade placed by an investor is ultimately settled between the buyer and the seller. The Depository Trust and the Clearing Corporation is the clearing agency that fills that role for securities. The current model, which requires a clearing agency clear and settle trades, just doesn't really make sense for digital assets operated on a blockchain. Transactions clear in real time, and there's no need for one centralized intermediary. Can you, continuing with this question, you mentioned in your testimony the perils of applying the definition of clearing agency under the Exchange Act to validators and miners on a blockchain that participate in the settlement process. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit for me?
Sure. So the definition of clearing agency under the Exchange Act is very broad, and it includes anyone that is facilitating the settlement of a securities transaction without the physical delivery of paper security certificates. That definition made sense in its context where it was regulating the securities market, the traditional securities market, and trying to bring a higher level of safety and security to the market where paper certificates were moving or where they were becoming dematerialized. Everyone in digital assets is facilitating the transfer of the asset without physical delivery, whether they are securities or not. But if they are securities, then arguably the definition would encompass a lot of different parties. Now, if a firm like a digital asset trading platform holds all the assets itself so that it can update its books in real time with every trade, it doesn't really seem like you need a separate clearing agency to just add an intermediation that is not actually technically necessary.
Thank you for your answer. The final point I'll say, legislation is needed to fix this. Thank you.